He's coming for me, a whisper, thin as old lace, cut through the deep, echoing silence. Father Michael O'Connell, a man more used to the quiet cadence of guilt and absolution than outright panic, was momentarily frozen. He had been kneeling alone in the back pew of St. Jude's, checking the frayed edges of the kneeler cushions, a mundane task for a Tuesday afternoon. The massive oak doors, usually secured with a heavy chain, were ajar, letting in a blinding afternoon sunbeam that looked like a scar across the polished marble floor. Silhouetted in the light was a child, a girl no older than 9, impossibly slight, with a wild tangle of brown hair and eyes that held a terror too profound for her small face. Her breath came in ragged, hyperventilating gasps, and her small chest heaved beneath a dirt-smeared cotton dress. She didn't approach the altar or the confessional. Instead, she bolted past the rows of empty pews, stopping only when she reached the foot of the enormous mahogany pulpit, a place of sermon and solemn declaration. She pressed her back against the cool wood, her body shaking so violently that the sound carried in the vast space. The desperation in her tiny frame was palpable, a raw, screaming wound in the heart of the sanctuary. Her small, blood-scraped hand was clamped tightly around a dark, unidentifiable object. She spoke again, louder this time, her voice cracking with the strain. "Please, Father. Hide me. Please." Father Michael rose slowly, his old knees protesting the sudden movement. His parish was in East Haven, a town known for its historic wealth and quiet, almost insulated life, a place where the greatest drama was usually a disagreement over the annual bazaar's profits. He wore a simple clerical shirt, and his presence, though comforting to some, was now an anomaly against the backdrop of the child's hysteria. Across the nave, Mrs. Eleanor Finch, the oldest and most devout parishioner, had been tending to the flower arrangement for Wednesday, Massachusetts. She stopped, the shears clicking against a rose stem and the sound echoing like a gunshot. Her face, usually set in an expression of beatific patience, shifted to one of open-mouthed shock. A young handyman, Matteo, who was repairing a loose slate tile on the roof, paused his work and peered down from the clerestory window, his rough, sweat-stained brow furrowed in confusion. The air inside the church, normally thick with the scent of beeswax and old incense, now carried a faint, metallic tang of dirt and maybe something worse. The scene was an immediate, brutal contrast, the gilded, serene silence of the sacred space against the grimy desperation of a child who had clearly run a very long way. Lily, still pinned against the pulpit, didn't seem to see the priest or the old woman. Her eyes were fixed on the double doors, tracking the sunlight, waiting for the shadow that she knew would inevitably follow. She was a living, breathing testament to a world outside St. Jude's walls, a world of concrete and fear that the parish tried to pretend didn't exist. Father Michael took a step toward her, his arms held open in a posture of non-threat. "It's all right, child," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "I'm Father Michael. No one will hurt you here." The contrast was almost unbearable, the sanctuary's peaceful light suddenly illuminating a raw wound from the outside world, demanding not prayer, but protection. The priest's gentle affirmation seemed to break a delicate spell. Lily finally turned her gaze from the door to the man who promised safety. She couldn't be older than 9. They got my mom," she choked out, the words catching in her throat, raw and painful. "They said if I told anyone, they'd get me, too. They didn't think I saw it." She spoke about a place, an accident, and papers that weren't supposed to exist. Her tale was disjointed, full of the fractured logic of a terrified mind, but the core was horrifyingly clear. This was no simple runaway. This was a witness, a survivor of an event involving immense secrecy and grave injustice. The problem wasn't a mean parent or a lost dog, it was something deep and dangerous. Lily swayed slightly, and Father Michael was next to her in an instant, helping her sit on the step of the pulpit. It was then, as her hand briefly relaxed, that everyone saw what she was clutching. It wasn't a toy or a comforting stuffed animal. It was a small, hand-bound journal, its leather cover heavily scorched and water-damaged, the pages swollen and brittle. The sight of it, this charred, fragile piece of evidence, caused Mrs. Finch to gasp, the sound echoing sharply. Father Michael gently touched the object, a dark, heavy silence descending on the 3 adults. It was the color of dried blood and ashes. He didn't have to open it to know it was the key. He looked into Lily's eyes, now pools of exhausted determination, and knew the truth. What she held was not just a symbol of her problem, but the damning proof of theirs. "What is this, Lily?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. She looked down at the journal. "My mother told me to keep it safe. She said it was the truth they wanted to bury. It's the names." The church held its breath, the air thick with unspoken fear, as the priest realized the profound, criminal weight of the small, charred book resting in the child's hands. Father Michael took the journal, his hands trembling slightly as he carefully opened the first stiff, warped page. The handwriting was a familiar, elegant script he recognized from old church records, the former parish secretary, Mrs. Elena Rodriguez, Lily's mother. What he saw wasn't a diary. It was a meticulous ledger, dating back years, detailing illicit payments, land deals illegally zoned, and, most damningly, a cover-up involving the tragic collapse of the North End housing project, the very accident Lily had mentioned. The names listed were not small-time criminals, they were titans of the community, council members, bank executives, and even the local chief of police, a man named Sterling. The priest's heart hammered against his ribs. The danger had just escalated from a domestic issue to a systemic threat. This wasn't just about saving Lily, it was about protecting a truth that could bring down the entire local infrastructure of power. Suddenly, the distant, low rumble of a powerful engine grew closer, then stopped. The sound of a heavy car door slamming echoed outside, followed by another. Two shadows fell across the sunbeam slicing through the open front doors. They were distinct, large, and moving with purpose. Mateo, the handyman, whispered down from the roof opening, "Father, 2 men. Black sedan. Expensive suits, but they look like they mean trouble." He looked at Lily, his eyes wide with recognition. "They're the ones who were asking questions in the alley earlier." The threat wasn't imminent, it was here. Father Michael instinctively shoved the charred journal inside the front of his cassock, covering it with his pectoral cross. He looked at Mrs. Finch, whose face was pale but determined. "Go to the sacristy, Eleanor. Lock the inner door. Do not come out. Mateo, stay put, but be ready to yell." He positioned himself in the center aisle, directly between the approaching men and the terrified child, silently praying for the strength to face the wolves that had just entered his sanctuary. A chilling sense of dread settled over the church as the footsteps grew louder, the confrontation no longer a distant possibility, but an unavoidable, life-altering certainty. The 2 men who entered were the physical embodiments of the ledger's contents, polished, expensive, and devoid of warmth. One, tall and sleek with close-cropped silver hair, was named Victor. The other, younger, bull-necked, and radiating menace, was known only as Graves. They scanned the empty pews with cold, professional eyes, their gaze sweeping over Father Michael and landing instantly on Lily, who was now hidden slightly behind the pulpit steps. Victor spoke first, his voice a low, silky baritone that managed to be intimidating despite its quiet volume. "Father O'Connell. Forgive the intrusion. We're looking for a little girl. Lily Rodriguez. Just a matter of a concerned uncle trying to locate his niece after a family misunderstanding." Father Michael stood firm, his aging frame suddenly seeming taller. "I see no family here, only a child who has asked for sanctuary. And misunderstandings do not leave a child in this state, Mr. Victor." Graves, impatient and clearly not a man for polite conversation, simply pointed a thick finger at Lily. "The girl is something of ours. She took it. We're taking her and the property back. Step aside, man of God." He took a menacing step forward. Father Michael didn't move an inch. "I understand you are searching for property. I assure you, no property leaves this church in the hands of men who bring such violence into a house of peace." The tension was suffocating. Lily, seeing Graves move, did something no one expected. She pushed herself fully into view. She didn't run or scream. Instead, she took the small, silver cross that hung around her neck, a gift from her mother, and hurled it with all her might. It hit Graves squarely on the cheek, a startling thwack that momentarily halted his advance. The act of defiant, desperate courage was shocking. It wasn't the impact that stopped him, it was the realization that this small, terrified thing was ready to fight them. Graves paused, rubbing his cheek, a silent fury in his eyes, realizing the child was not simply a victim to be reclaimed, but a threat to be managed. The brief, unexpected clash shattered the tension, forcing the priest and the goons to confront the moral boundaries of the sacred space. Graves was prepared to ignore the sanctuary and move. Victor, however, was sharper. He realized that Father Michael, standing there in the middle of his church, represented a very public risk. "We'll be back, Father," Victor hissed, his voice losing its veneer of civility. "She belongs with family. You have just involved yourself in a matter far beyond your station." As Graves advanced again, the priest made his move. He pulled a cell phone from his pocket, which he had silently retrieved during Victor's speech, and held it up, screen lit, with a number already dialed: Detective Harding, a good, honest man on the county force who had grown up in the parish. "I have Detective Harding on the line," Father Michael announced, his voice clear and ringing. "He's been advised that 2 men matching your description are attempting to forcibly remove a terrified minor witness from St. Jude's and are demanding property that I believe is evidence of the North End fraud case. You can wait for him, or you can leave now." Victor's eyes narrowed, but the risk calculation was instantaneous. A public scene with a police detective and a priest was bad for business. He gave a sharp nod to Graves. The 2 men backed out, the roar of their black sedan quickly fading into the distance. Lily was safe, for the next hour, perhaps. Father Michael collapsed onto a pew, physically and emotionally drained. Lily was secure, but a new, larger problem immediately presented itself. They had just publicly defied powerful, ruthless men. The local authorities were compromised, and the system would only offer a clean, bureaucratic path straight back into danger. They needed a fortress, not just a holding cell. The immediate threat was gone, but the victory was thin and temporary, leaving behind the immense, quiet question of how to build a safe future. Father Michael knew he couldn't take Lily to the police station. The ledger in his vestments was a time bomb waiting to be disarmed, and he couldn't trust Chief Sterling's men. He quietly called in his small, unlikely circle of trust. Mrs. Finch became the primary caregiver, her stern exterior melting away to reveal a surprising, grandmotherly warmth. Mateo, the handyman, a gruff former Marine with a gentle spirit, became the unofficial watchman and Lily's reluctant friend, teaching her how to hammer a nail straight. The small, unused rectory wing quickly transformed. Lily's new room was a former storage space, now filled with mismatched blankets and a few hand-me-down books donated by Mrs. Finch. The trauma didn't vanish, but it began to recede. Lily was a small sponge, soaking up the affection she hadn't known existed. She didn't sleep well for weeks, plagued by nightmares that would send her running to Father Michael's door, where he'd sit with her, reading stories from an old children's Bible, his hands, once only used for blessing and absolution, awkwardly learning how to braid her hair. The priest, who had lived a life of orderly solitude, suddenly found himself navigating the world of scraped knees, picky eating, and the sheer, exhausting volume of a 9-year-old's emotions. He had to learn to replace solemn silence with reassuring chatter, and Latin prayers with simple promises of protection. Mateo, initially distant, found Lily waiting for him every morning with a mug of watered-down coffee and a drawing of a smiling soldier. Mrs. Finch taught Lily how to bake the perfect communion bread and, more importantly, how to laugh again, a bright, unrestrained sound that slowly pushed the shadows out of the old rectory walls. The bond wasn't conventional, it was forged in shared secrecy and escalating danger. They were no longer just a priest, a devout elderly woman, and a gruff handyman. They were a fiercely protective, unconventional family, united by the small, frightened girl who had run into their lives with the truth in her hands. Just as trust began to blossom within their makeshift family, the formal, impartial scrutiny of the outside world arrived, demanding a clinical judgment. The system arrived 6 weeks later in the form of Miss Patricia Wells, a sharp, impeccably dressed social worker from the Department of Child Services, DCS, accompanied by a uniformed, but not threatening, officer. They were there due to an anonymous tip, almost certainly placed by Victor's organization, about an unsupervised and potentially unstable living situation. The temporary sanctuary was now under bureaucratic siege. Ms. Wells was polite but detached, her clinical gaze dissecting the unconventional arrangement. The initial interview in Father Michael's sparsely furnished office was a tense moral debate. Ms. Wells's mandate was clear: place Lily in a vetted, traditional foster home. Father Michael's argument was emotional but grounded in the damning truth of the ledger, which he had wisely given to the federal authorities outside of the county's jurisdiction, but which the local DCS was unaware of. "Look at us, Ms. Wells," the priest argued, gesturing to Mateo, whose arms were covered in faded tattoos, and Mrs. Finch, whose face was a map of deep wrinkles. "We are not ideal foster parents. But we are a shield. This child is safe here." A clean, approved home would simply be a clean, approved target for the people who want this child silenced. Ms. Wells countered with rules and protocol, citing the need for stability, background checks, and proper licensing. "Father, this is chaos. You are obstructing due process. These people, your team, have no official standing. Lily needs normalcy." The true climax came when they brought Lily in. She was no longer the shaking waif of 6 weeks ago. She was still small, but composed. The question was simple, clinical: "Lily, where do you want to live?" The eyes of the priest, the social worker, and the police officer were all fixed on her. The stakes were everything. The fate of the little girl hung precariously in the balance, resting not on legal precedent or protocol, but on the brave, heartfelt words of a 9-year-old. Lily looked at the immaculate Ms. Wells, then at Father Michael, whose face was lined with genuine fear, not for himself, but for her. She walked over to the priest and took his hand, then turned back to the social worker. Her voice, though still small, was steady and firm. "They aren't normal," she stated simply, referring to her protectors. "They're weird. Father Michael sings bad. Mrs. Finch makes me eat too many carrots. Mateo curses when he drops his hammer." She paused, then the emotional breakthrough came. "But they are the only people who ever told a man with a scary voice to leave me alone. They are the only people who let me see my mom's truth. I don't want a normal family. I want my family." The authenticity of her testimony, the simple, undeniable truth in her defense of her unconventional guardians, was devastatingly effective. Ms. Wells's professional mask finally cracked. The officer, a father himself, averted his gaze, a lump clearly visible in his throat. The next morning, the call came, due to the ongoing federal investigation, triggered by the ledger, and the unique circumstances of the threat. The court had granted temporary emergency guardianship to Father Michael, with Mrs. Finch and Mateo designated as official caregivers. The unorthodox family was legally, if tentatively, united. The victory was quiet, a judicial acknowledgement that sometimes, true safety is found outside the rigid lines of the system. Lily looked up at the priest, a genuine, unrestrained smile spreading across her face. "Now, Father," she announced, tugging on his sleeve, "I think we need to teach Mateo not to curse." The closure was not just an ending, but a new beginning, solidifying a bond stronger than blood or bureaucracy. 5 years later, the light in St. Jude's was brighter. The charred journal, having served its purpose, had indeed brought down the entrenched local corruption. Chief Sterling and Victor's associates were indicted and convicted in a massive federal sting operation. The North End housing project was finally being rebuilt, not by corrupt contractors, but by a non-profit foundation. Lily was 14 now, not a child, but a vibrant young woman with a sharp wit and an infectious, loud laugh. She excelled in school and served as an acolyte, her small, steady hands lighting the candles every Sunday. Father Michael had not only learned to braid hair, but also how to navigate middle school parent-teacher conferences. His sermons had taken on a new depth, grounded not just in scripture, but in the gritty reality of human redemption. Mrs. Finch ran the rectory with the efficiency of a CEO, and Mateo, now licensed and sober, ran the church's new outreach program, the Sanctuary Net, a rapid response network that provided safe harbor for children escaping abusive or dangerous situations. The community, once insulated and detached, had been irrevocably changed by the presence of one small girl. They had been forced to look past their gilded facades and see the darkness, and then, more importantly, to become the light. Lily's story was their story now, a reminder that the most profound acts of courage often come wrapped in small packages. The final lesson, often repeated by Father Michael in his sermons, was simple, yet indelible: fear is the silence of the soul. But true hope is the sound of a small heart running home.